Hello and welcome to The Real Reflected, where I try to have a philosophical look at an event. Could be a current event or recent event. Today we'll be having a look at a political event, but it doesn't have to be. It could be sort of anything that's worth having a look at, really. So today the event is what's happened in California recently. So I should add that today is the 13th of June 2025, so mid-June 2025. So what's happened? Well, in Los Angeles particularly, the immigration police went down there and started just essentially snatching people up from the streets, arresting them, detaining them, using fairly random charges at times. This has caused some protest to happen in the streets of Los Angeles, and as a reaction to that, the Trump administration, or Trump himself probably, decided to deploy National Guards and military troops in the streets of Los Angeles. Right? And then the final episode in that was that 2 days ago, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, released a video, basically an 8-minute speech in which he directly attacked everything that's Donald Trump and his administration have done with regard to the events in Los Angeles. So I want to have a look at that. I'm not going to go into detail of the video itself. If you're watching this a bit later, you'd have to find it on the internet if you don't remember what he exactly says in the video. But at the end of that speech, he makes an interesting point, and a very important point. He says democracy itself is at stake. Now, you could say it's perhaps a bit of political rhetoric, but I don't think so, really. I think he's very right about this. Democracy is at stake. So what does that mean? That's the point I want to have a look at today. Now, when you think of democracy in today's world, where, well, democratic societies are typically very large-scale, and when I say large-scale, I mean mass societies, right? We don't have small communities anymore. That means that democracy today is essentially what we call representative democracy, right? There's no country in the world where people directly decide the policies that will follow, right? We are represented by a number of people, which we call politicians, right? So that's representative democracy. We elect people that represent our interests, our ideas for us, right? And who are we? Well, we are then the people or the citizens of that country. Now, there's a paradox with this idea of representative democracy, which is that essentially there is no real representation. That's the big paradox. Representative democracy cannot be representational. Why not? Because when you take the points of view of the people and you cut them off from the reality from which they stem, well, you basically reduce it to something it wasn't before, and you transform it, and you could even argue you distort that point of view, those multiple ideas, because of course the people is not one homogeneous unit, right? It's a multitude of ideas. So if you put that in philosophical terms, you could say that the people that are being represented, the represented, are actually not present in the representation, so which is what the representatives claim to do, right? They represent the people. So that's the paradox, right? The represented is not present in the representation. They're absent. Now you could say, well, that's just a question of degree, right? Of course, if you represent somebody, you're never going to be exactly on the same page as the people you represent. That's sort of a practical problem, but I'm just pointing out something really more fundamental, a fundamental paradox, that there's always an element of absence in the representation, and so it contradicts the idea of democracy. So why is this so important? It's that when you represent people, what you do, there's two things that actually happen. Is, first of all, as I said, their points of view are no longer really present. And second, they are put in a passive position, right? Because the representative takes on the job. He or she acts. Right? The other people that are represented, they give away their point of view, so to speak. They abandon it to the other person or to the people that represent them. So they're put in a passive position, right? Now, when you have a situation like here in California where people are going into the street and protesting, that's a very precious moment where people actually act again. They become active members of society and they voice their opinion directly. So it's a very precious moment. So that's why it's so important that that be honoured, which is exactly what the Trump administration decided not to do, right? So you see that this question of democracy and being represented or not, it's not just a question of, or it's not confined to the area of lawmaking. It's actually anything it's related to anything in the public sphere, as we see here in the example of California. Okay, so now we see how this idea of democracy is sort of related to what's happened in terms of protests in California. But there's the other aspect, right? People being arrested, the state showing its sort of violent nature. And you can say, well, that's basically what happened, was that the state or the government just violated all state laws or federal laws or even constitutional principles. That's why it's unacceptable what the Trump administration has done there. But let's just imagine, for the sake of argument, that let's imagine it was actually, formally speaking, lawful, what they did. Again, it wasn't, but let's just assume it was. You would still have an issue with what actually happened there. And I think the best way to understand that is to categorize what we just talked about in terms of how to define a real democracy, in terms of bottom-up versus top-down. Right? It's words that we use in anything that's related to organization. But it's a good way to start, because it's a good way to kind of make sense of what's actually going on here. So bottom up, it means that things come from the bottom and then it sort of, it finds its way up, right? That's what it means, right? So what does that mean here with regards to democracy? Well, it's what I was trying to say before, is that democracy is only possible when the point of view of the people, or maybe we should even say peoples, that they are the basis of anything that happens in the public sphere, right? And that basically, in a representative democracy, yes, you need at some point for that point of view, or these points of views, and thus also the power of making laws, of making policy, to be basically transferred. But it can never be abandoned, because, again, for things to have meaning, democratically speaking, it needs to be related to those experiences of the people. Now that relates to a very important point in the history of philosophy, and it's almost like philosophy of language, like what actually is meaning. I'm not going to go into that, but just know that's a whole topic in itself. So things only have meaning when they're related to experiences that people have. So that's why I call it a bottom-up. Now, there's another way to talk about this in philosophical terms. We'd call that immanent. So the idea of democracy with regard to now the idea of the state versus the people, so we're talking about the question of power, you would say is an immanent notion or an immanent conception of power. Power is not transferred to the top and then basically functions top-down. People abandon their power. No, the idea is people are never completely disempowered. Right? That's this idea, again, which is a very important idea in the history of philosophy. Now, opposite to that, you'd have the top-down approach, where the idea is that in any kind of social system, so any society, for it to be possible, that's the philosophical way to think about this, for a society to be possible, and what does that mean? Well, it means for societal order, for law and order to be maintained, basically the only way that's going to be possible, so is the argument at least, is when the people decide to transfer the power, so basically the state power, legitimacy, transfer it to a central body, which we then call the state or the government, and that body then has the public authority, right? That body detains the power in that society, right? So power is actually abandoned, right? People give it up, because the idea is if you give it back to the people, then we cannot guarantee order, we cannot guarantee lawfulness, etc. That's a very important idea in the history of philosophy, particularly in modern philosophy. So you can call that the opposite of immanent, which in philosophy we'd say is transcendent, right? So that which transcends, it goes above that. It transcends the people and then it goes top down. So basically what we have here with Trump is that in a very brutal form, a very brutal way, is a top-down approach. It's a transcendent idea of power. And again, as we said before, it's not even democratic anymore. But again, that's almost like secondary, because even in democratic regimes, you have these two different approaches as well, immanent versus transcendent. So here we have it in its most blatant and brutal form, right? A top-down approach, which resembles, is becoming very clear now, which resembles more dictatorship than a democracy. So there's a very stark opposition between that view of society, transcendent, versus the immanent idea or immanent notion of power. And so that allows us to kind of see how serious the situation is, right, in the United States, but you can take other examples, right, that it's no longer about anything related to democracy, right? The idea of true democracy, the idea of an immanence of the people deciding, of being able to express themselves, the idea of a public sphere having only meaning if it comes from the people, that's completely abandoned here, right? And beneath that, and that's, I think, last thing I want to say about this, you have two different views, really worldviews about humans, about what humans are. In a transcendent vision of society, the idea seems to always be that you can't trust humans to do things by themselves. Right? If you just let them do things by themselves, basically, on a societal level, chaos will ensue. Right? That's basically the idea. So there's a real strong distrust of human nature in that, particularly if you go back to the Enlightenment period where these ideas basically come from. And opposite to that, you have this idea of belief in humans. Right? If you give humans the power to do things, if you allow them to invest themselves, to be committed to certain political actions, to be involved in the political sphere or in the public sphere in general, that's when things will have meaning for them, and that's when true democracy can happen, right? So these are really two opposite views of what is to be human, really. And so you see that when a transcendent notion of power really expresses itself in a pure form, we see now what that can lead to, right? Now we're no longer in the territory or in the realm of ideas. We see in real life and real societal matters what that leads to. So that's something I wanted to reflect upon today. So next time we'll talk about something else. All right, see you soon.